So I've had long-running arguments with some of my friends and colleagues about the definition of first-pass success. I may have even had this discussion with some of y'all. The argument, when there is one, goes something like this. Me. If we're going to measure things that we think are important, we should measure them correctly, which means using standard definitions. Fortunately, there is a well-accepted definition for intubation first-pass success. It's been used extensively in the literature. What is it? A first-pass success is when the ET tube is placed through the cords, as confirmed to the presence of four-phase end-tidal CO2 waveform, within the period of time between blade insertion past the teeth, or the alveolar ridge in our tooth-challenged population, and blade removal. In other words, within one laryngoscopy attempt. Them. But that's not fair. Some airways are harder than others, and that definition penalizes those who appropriately abort an intubation attempt to reoxygenate, to ventilate, or to better prepare the airway through suction. Using that definition encourages people to stay and play in the airway longer than is safe for the patient. Therefore, your definition, Jeff, is killing people. So that's pretty much how the argument has gone, more or less unchanged, for the past at least 5 years. Now, I, of course, think this issue was settled a long time ago. I think the entire argument now boils down to how best to use the measure rather than its definition. I thought that is, until now. I just read a paper that is challenging how I think about this first-pass measure. Perhaps, despite me being right, of course, perhaps it's time to update the definition of first-pass success. We might be able to update that old argument in the process. Stick around for the details of the paper and a picture of what future discussions on this topic may look like. We'll be right back.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located in an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
Howdy, y'all. I'm Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Welcome back to another episode of the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast. You know the one where we shine the bright light of science in the darkness of current EMS clinical practice. So back to that argument about the definition of first-pass success. I may have been exaggerating the extent to which this discussion is actually an argument, but let's be honest, it's more fun that way. Up until now, this discussion is really about how we should use performance measures, or at least that's the way I interpret it. This excludes those, obviously, who do not even know that there is a real definition. Unfortunately, I think most medics are likely in that group. Now, to be clear, I don't blame medics for not knowing this. After all, I seriously doubt many EMS agencies look at any clinical metrics, much less let their clinicians know how those metrics are calculated. I do, however, blame medical directors and their clinical staff for not doing so. Now, because I can't help myself, I feel the need to talk a bit about how I think measures should and should not be used. The whole point of measurement is to improve system-level care. Now, I'm a big advocate for reporting measures only on a system level and not an individual level. I will never report on this type of measure at the individual level because I don't think doing so improves system performance, and I worry that it could actually be harmful. Think about what the typical intubation first-pass success rate would be from month to month for the typical EMS clinician. It would alternate between 0% and 100% because maybe their N is one intubation a month. And we all know that the number of their intubations for most people is likely much lower than that. I call this the tyranny of small numbers. You just can't get an accurate measure of real performance with such small numbers. Since most of what I know about quality improvement, I learned from the improvement guru himself, my friend Mike Tagman, I figured I'd turn to him for his thoughts. Here are a couple of good quotes he gave me on this topic while we were talking about it. Common wisdom in improvement science is to focus first on system level improvement. Once that has been fully optimized, then and only then move to focus on individual level performance. I've yet to see an EMS agency fully optimize system level improvement. So, in other words, this is about systems, almost never about individuals, because focusing on individual level improvement, that's not where the meat is. That's not where the money is. That's not where your Pareto chart says you should focus. To be clear, this doesn't mean ignore your individuals. Feedback for them is very useful, but for something entirely different. We know from the work of Dr. Crow that feedback for individuals, particularly directly from the medical director, goes a really long way toward increasing staff engagement and decreasing burnout. Those are all very good things, but they're different than improving system level performance. Now, Mike also gave me another story. He said focus on individual level performance can also be counterproductive, and he relayed his experience with QI with his first cardiac arrest. He said he got the chart back, paper chart, of course, and it had heavy red ink all over it. And it said, in this system, we give epi every 5 minutes. Now, he might have said something about bicarb, but I couldn't bring myself to include that in this podcast. Evidence-based medicine and all. So Mike says his next code, he just added 5 minutes to each dose and everything was good. No actual clinical improvement happened, but the chart looked great. So we've had some great discussion about this on Twitter, and I want to read a tweet from Jace Mullen because I really think it discusses this issue of individual performance. He said, I'm thinking now of a conversation with an old medical director about our agency's first pass success rate. His medical director said, they're terrible, but I don't think people would be this honest. And Jay says, Doc, those are the unhonest numbers. And his point here is think about what the honest ones would be. I think that's exactly the issue we're dealing with. All right, so getting back to the improvement topics, because I really don't think I can summarize improvement topics any better than Mike. So let's leave this discussion of the best approach to improvement alone and get back to whether there might be a better definition than the standard definition, the one where the blade enters the mouth, the tube is passed, the blade leaves the mouth. First, I think most people recognize that while this definition is necessary to avoid adverse events, it isn't sufficient. We know that failure to achieve first pass success is associated with an increase in adverse events, including peri-intubation hypoxia, hypotension, and even cardiac arrest. But the problem, which I think is really at the heart of my friend's argument about the traditional definition, is that first pass success can be achieved even with prolonged attempts at passing a tube that may be associated with some real badness. A much better measure that incorporates these concerns is first pass success without hypoxia or hypotension. The so-called -1A measure, definitive airway success, sans hypotension or hypoxia in one attempt. Describing what that acronym means is a mouthful, but -1A is a whole lot better and faster to say than first pass success without hypoxia or hypotension. So with this concept in mind, is there a better definition for the first pass success component of the -1A compound measure? Now this brings me, finally, I hear my son saying, to the paper for today's episode. Now, the citation for this is defining successful intubation on the first attempt using both laryngoscope and endotracheal tube insertions, a secondary analysis of clinical trial data. This paper was by Dr. Stacy Trent, Brian Driver, and colleagues, and it is currently in press with Annals of Emergency Medicine. Now, although this paper was structured more as a study, I think it is far more important as an op-ed that suggests an important conceptual change. It is, however, dressed up as, science and with some sciencey bits and some study bits. So let's cover those. So the basic premise is an argument, again, scienced up, but still an argument, that the definition of first pass success should be revised from one that focuses on the number of attempts at laryngoscopy, regardless of the number of attempts at tube passage, to a new definition that includes both the number of attempts at laryngoscopy and the number of attempts at tube passage. Now, Trent makes the convincing argument that we've entered a brave new world in which the ready availability of video laryngoscopes, especially those with a hyperacute geometry blade, moves the difficulty of intubation from laryngoscopy, where moving the anatomy out of the way to directly visualize the chords is the challenging part, to an era in which visualization is easy, but actual tube passage is the challenging part. Now, anyone who grew up intubating with direct laryngoscopy, like I did, only to have a glide scope thrust into their hands, they understand this distinction perfectly. This is exactly how I felt when, after about 10 years of doing direct laryngoscopy, I was first handed a glide scope in residency. Now, have you ever said, after getting really frustrated with a video intubation attempt, man, I had this beautiful view of the chords, but I just couldn't get the tube to pass? Well, if so, you understand the difference Trent is getting at here. Now, we frequently see a single laryngoscopy attempt that involves multiple, sometimes prolonged attempts at tube passage. And according to the standard definition, this would still be a first pass success. So what do Trent and her colleagues propose instead? They suggest first pass should be a single attempt at laryngoscopy and a single attempt at passing either an ET tube or a bougie through the chords. Now, this definition is obviously more difficult to achieve and is likely to be associated with a lower first pass success rate, but it better reflects the reality that intubation is a combination of laryngoscopy and tube passage. We should probably combine both of these components into our definition of first pass success. So that's the argument. I happen to think that just getting this argument out into the open is the real value of this paper. I immediately saw what they were getting at as soon as I read the abstract. I knew I was on board, having spent so much time trying to understand and then teach the difference between laryngoscopy and tube passage, especially when we're talking about hyperacute geometry VL. Now, having said that, we probably should cover the sciencey bits, though. So let's get at it. So this was a secondary analysis of two prospective randomized controlled trials, the Bougie trial and Prekker 2. Bougie involved randomizing patients to intubation with standard geometry blades to either bougie or stylet use. Prekker 2 randomized patients undergoing RSI to getting a fluid bolus or no fluid bolus. Both, and this is the part where it's relevant to this paper, both involved detailed data collection on intubation that used an independent observer to record both the number of laryngoscope attempts and the number of attempts at tube passage. Now, they also recorded the duration of the attempts in the presence of any adverse events. Trent combined the intubation data from these two trials to evaluate the impact of two different definitions of first pass success in this population. All right, so let's run the PICO question. So the population, these were adults undergoing intubation in one of multiple different academic medical centers in the ED or the ICU. There were no EMS intubations included in either of these trials. The intervention, so to speak, was the proposed definition of first pass success: one attempt at laryngoscopy and one attempt at tube passage. The control was the traditional definition of first pass success. That is, one attempt with any number of attempts at tube passage. So it could be one laryngoscopic attempt plus one tube passage attempt or multiple attempts at tube passage. The primary outcome was the rate of first pass success defined using these two different definitions. Secondary outcomes included attempt duration and the rate of adverse events. Now, to be clear, both first pass success definitions included the same definition of a laryngoscopy attempt. That is, the time between the blade passing the teeth on the way in and the blade passing the teeth on the way out. Now, I sort of think the results here are pretty predictable, which is why I'm way more excited about the concept than the study, but let's do them anyway. To summarize what we're looking at here, they took all patients from both trials, they calculated the first pass success, the attempt duration, and the rate of adverse events using two different definitions of first pass success, 1 + 1 versus 1 + any, the standard definition. Overall, there were 1,863 patients in the combined data set, and of these, 75% were intubated with VL and 25% with DL. The most common reason for intubation was respiratory failure, followed by altered mental status. And overall, 62% of patients were intubated in the ICU. Now, first pass success rates were 81% using the new definition and 86% using the standard or old definition. That's an absolute difference of negative 4.9% with a 95% confidence interval between negative 5.9 and negative 3.9, meaning it is statistically significant. The bottom line is that there is a 5% reduction in first pass success when using this new definition. It's harder to obtain. This makes perfect sense. Something else that makes perfect sense is the duration of attempts. Using the new definition, that was a median 120 seconds versus 155 seconds using the standard definition. Also statistically significant. Adverse event rates, those were 23.1 with the new definition and 26.9 using the standard definition. This difference, however, was not statistically significant. So, to summarize the results, the proposed more rigorous definition, not surprisingly, resulted in lower first pass success rates and longer attempts, but with no difference in adverse events. Again, my take is that these numbers really don't matter. I suspect they performed this comparison only to get it accepted in a high-impact journal where it would likely be seen by lots of people. Now, I don't really blame them, but to be clear, they would have had me at the concept alone. The numbers, just cherry on top. I think they make a really good argument. We should include both components of an intubation attempt in our definition of first pass success. Both laryngoscopy and tube passage, those are important and they're distinct, and our definition should include both. Let's acknowledge the reality of using this definition, though. It's going to be harder to measure. Most EMS agencies that measure first pass success do so using the medic's documented success rate. In other words, what they put in the chart. And EMS EPCRs capture only the overall attempt and whether it was successful or not. And don't even get me started on those that allow you to document number of attempts and number of successes. That drives me batshit crazy. Horrible data structure. So in these EPCRs, there is no way for medics to document the number of attempts at tube passage. It's just this data black box. Hate black boxes. This means that in order to accurately measure this, we're going to need to review recordings of video intubations, and this is exactly as it should be. This alone should be able to help medical directors justify recording video laryngoscopes. At MedStar in the Fort Worth system, we review both the monitor data and the video recordings from our UE scope video laryngoscopes, and we use that information when determining first pass success without hypotension or hypoxia. Now, we've been using, and by we, I mean Kirby Johnson and Dr. Brian Miller, we have been using the standard definition when applying the data we get from those reviews, but I promise you we will definitely be considering this new definition going forward. Now, speaking of what Kirby and Brian are finding, one interesting factoid that we're still working hard to quantify is the importance of including review of the monitor files when calculating -1A. We have found that there is definitely a difference in this rate if you're using only the vital signs from the chart as opposed to using the data from your chart and your monitor data. We're still working to quantify that to figure out what that difference is, but the bottom line is you need to be looking at the monitor data and your video files. We're hoping to get all this stuff organized, and we're going to try to publish it in the future. So my bottom line takeaway on this paper is that Dr. Trent had me with the title alone. Although I'd never have thought of this myself, as soon as I saw the paper, I was immediately on board. I love the concept and look forward to operationalizing it within my system. Now, I hope this episode makes y'all think like it made me think. I love having my ideas challenged, and I thank Dr. Trent and her colleagues for doing so with this paper. Thanks, y'all, and have a great day.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the Flightbridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.